The drawer had been sealed for longer than my apprentice had been alive. I knew it the moment she set the folder on my table, the amber oxidation on the seal band, the way the locking pin had fused slightly with the housing from decades of disuse, the particular shade of archive gray the cover had gone in the absence of handling. Files that are consulted regularly stay pale. Files that are left alone go that color like old bone. I recognized it. I had not looked at this folder in 31 years, and I had not thought about it often in that time. And when I did think about it, I thought about it the way you think about a scar on a part of your body you have learned to stop touching. My apprentice, whose name is Teva Rulsureth, and who is 22 years old and sharp in the way that young cartographers are sharp before experience teaches them what sharpness costs, had found it in the sub-level stacks while she was reorganizing the pre-expansion catalog drawers. She had dusted it off. She had looked at the seal and read what it said. And then, because she is 22 and sharp, and the seal said Sector 9/Veth-Amoran, Administrative Reach/Records SCALED BY Guild Order, Authorization, Master Archivist SOVALDETH. She had brought it directly to me rather than opening it herself. I will always be grateful for that restraint, not because the contents are dangerous in any material sense, not because there is anything inside that folder that could still harm her or me or this station or this guild, but because some things deserve to be opened in the presence of someone who understands what they are. A body on a table deserves a physician, not a passerby. These files were a body. I looked at the folder for a moment. Teva waited. She has learned in her 2 years under my supervision that I will explain things in my own time and that pressing me is counterproductive. She stood at the end of my table with her hands laced in front of her, and she watched me not open the folder, and she did not ask why I was not opening it. I appreciated that too. Then I pulled the folder toward me, worked the fused pin out of its housing with the flat of my thumbnail, a trick I have performed enough times with enough old seals that my thumbnail is slightly deformed on that side, and I opened it. The smell hit first. Archive cold, antiseptic, the particular dry sterility of documents that have been in sealed storage long enough that even the paper analog has forgotten what circulating air feels like. Then the top sheet, a survey manifest, Veth-Amoran Administrative Standard, the header printed in their characteristic double-font layout, one column for the administrative designation, one column for the surveyor's notation. The ink had gone from blue-black to brown at the edges, but the text was clean. Sector designation, 9. Administrative classification, resource acquisition target, category prime. Surveying authority, Veth-Amoran Central Reach, Expansion Division 7. Survey status, Phase 3 integration pending. KARTHARI Guild notation. Filed for record, accuracy VRIFIED. Guild date stamp 1104.7. I had date stamped that line myself. I remembered doing it. I had been 43 years old and my hands had been steadier than they are now, and I had not known yet what I was date stamping. "Sit down," I said to Teva. "This is going to take some time." She sat. I set the survey manifest aside and began to work through the folder from the top. There were 61 documents in it, and I had read all 61 of them once before, on a single long night 31 years ago, in this same room, at a different table, with 3 other master archivists sitting around me and none of us speaking very much. I had read them again twice after that night, alone, in the weeks that followed, when I was still trying to make the shape of what happened fit into a shape I could hold without it cutting me. After the second reading, I had sealed the folder and filed it and put it in the sub-level stacks, and I had not returned to it. What I am going to tell you is what those files said, and what they did not say, and what the spaces between them mean if you have been a cartographer long enough to know how to read a map not just by what it shows, but by what it leaves blank. The Veth-Amoran were administrators. I want to be precise about that, because in the years since their disappearance there has been a tendency, among species that did not know them well, and some that did, to describe them in terms that give them a weight and a grandeur they did not quite possess. They were not conquerors in the way that word implies a certain blood-and-fire romanticism. They were not warlords. They were not destroyers. They were, in every meaningful sense, a bureaucratic civilization, one that had discovered, very early in their expansion history, that the most efficient method of acquiring resources was not to fight for them but to classify them. Their central innovation, the one that made them the dominant administrative force in the outer Carthari belt for nearly 400 years, was what they called the integration protocol. It is worth explaining, because without it the files in this folder make no sense. When the Veth-Amoran encountered a new civilization, or a new resource-bearing territory, and in their taxonomy these were the same category, they sent survey ships first. The survey ships did not carry weapons in any significant quantity. What they carried were cartographers, census takers, and what the Veth-Amoran called classification specialists, which was a title that meant exactly what it sounds like. The classification specialist's job was to assess what is here, what is it worth, what infrastructure exists that can be absorbed, and how many individual units, meaning how many people reside in the territory, and what is their current organizational capacity. The assessment was then filed with the Central Reach. The Central Reach issued an administrative designation. After that, the integration protocol began. The protocol had 4 phases. Phase 1 was observation, passive data collection, no contact. Phase 2 was what they called soft contact, which meant official communication. The Veth-Amoran would send a diplomatic vessel to inform the territory's governing bodies that they had been designated under the protocol, and that integration would proceed on a stated timeline. Phase 3 was what they called chip census implementation, which was the part of the protocol that other civilizations found most alarming when they encountered it. Though by that point in the process, most of the civilizations that encountered it had already made the decision, or had it made for them. That resistance was impractical. The chip census was exactly what it sounds like. Identification implants, distributed to every individual in the territory, carrying biometric data, location data, financial data, and a resource yield classification. What an individual contributed in economic and biological terms to the territory's aggregate value. Phase 4 was full integration. The territory became a sector of the administrative reach. Its governing bodies were replaced with Veth-Amoran sector offices. Its resources were routed through the Central Reach's distribution network. Its people continued to live their lives, largely, in the way they had before, but their lives were now legible to the Central Reach in a way that made them, in practical terms, components of a machine that served Veth-Amoran interests. This had been done to 63 civilizations before the Veth-Amoran reached what they called, in their survey manifest of the 31st year of their eastern expansion, Sector 9. Teva said quietly, "How many of the 63 still exist?" I turned to the next page. "That is a question," I said, "for later in the folder. I will tell you the answer now, because you are not Teva and you do not have the folder in front of you, and because the answer is relevant to understanding everything that follows. Of the 63 civilizations that the Veth-Amoran had integrated into their administrative reach, by the time they began the Sector 9 survey, 51 still existed in some form at the time the reach dissolved. The remaining 12 had ceased to exist as coherent civilizations during the integration period or in its aftermath, not because the Veth-Amoran had destroyed them, but because integration into an administrative apparatus that size, and then the withdrawal of that apparatus when the reach dissolved, had consequences that the Veth-Amoran had not modeled, and in most cases had not intended. Administrative dependency, resource allocation failures, the collapse of governance structures that had been replaced with sector offices, and then abandoned when those offices closed. The Veth-Amoran had not set out to end those 12 civilizations. They had simply administered them, and then they had stopped administering them, and the gap left behind was the wrong shape for anything that had been there before. I include this not as an indictment of the Veth-Amoran. I include it as context. When the folder says that 63 civilizations complied with the integration protocol, it means 63 civilizations that did not resist, and the reason most of them did not resist is not documented in any way that makes it simple. Some complied because they judged it pragmatic. Some because they did not have the military capacity to do otherwise. Some because the Veth-Amoran's diplomatic administrators were skillful at framing the protocol as beneficial, and it was, in some material ways, beneficial in the short term. The administrative reach provided infrastructure, trade access, resource distribution networks. The chip census was intrusive and the loss of governing sovereignty was real, but the 63 had weighed their options and complied. What the Veth-Amoran were asking, in the 42nd cycle, of Sector 9, was the same thing they had asked 63 times before and been given 63 times before. This is, I think, the deepest thing the folder teaches. Not that humanity was uniquely powerful or uniquely dangerous in some simple military sense, but that the Veth-Amoran's model of what a civilization would accept, what it would recognize as legitimate authority, what it would weigh against its own capacity and decide to absorb, was built on 63 data points that had all, in the end, made the same choice. Sector 9 had not been asked yet, but the chip census implementation was the asking. And whatever answer Sector 9 gave was the one that ended the sentence. The survey of Sector 9 was conducted over a period of what Veth-Amoran timekeeping called 11 administrative cycles, which translates to approximately 14 standard years. I want you to understand the scope of that survey, because it is important to the shape of what happened afterward. 14 years of passive observation. 14 years of survey ships, Veth-Amoran vessels, small and quiet and built for data gathering rather than announcement, moving through the outer edges of the territory, listening, recording, mapping. They were very good at not being noticed. This is documented in their own survey records, not as a boast but as a technical metric. Veth-Amoran survey ships operated under what they called a low-signature protocol, minimal engine output, communication silent, positioned at ranges calculated to be below the detection threshold of whatever sensor arrays the target civilization was operating at the time. The classification specialists aboard those ships had done this work for 63 previous territories. They were professionals. They made very few mistakes. The survey data they compiled on Sector 9 is extraordinary. I am using that word carefully. I have read survey data from 300 territories over the course of my career as a cartographer and archivist. I have read the Veth-Amoran's own survey data on 15 of their previous 63 integration targets, because those files came into Carthari Guild possession through various historical channels, and I have studied them for professional reasons. I know what Veth-Amoran's survey data looks like when it describes a civilization they consider routine. I know what the columns mean, and how the classification specialists write their notations when they are confident, and how they write them when they are not. The survey data on Sector 9 is not routine. The earliest entries, the first 2 administrative cycles, the opening years of the observation period, are standard. The classification specialists were watching what they had been told to watch for: population density, organizational complexity, resource extraction activity, military infrastructure. Their notations are professional and even slightly dismissive in the way that Veth-Amoran survey specialists were sometimes dismissive when they encountered a civilization that appeared, at first assessment, to be in an early stage of interstellar development. There are phrases in the early entries that translate, roughly, as intermediate tier acquisition target, an integration timeline estimated at moderate complexity, and chip census implementation. Standard protocol applicable. The shift begins in the fourth cycle. The fourth cycle entries are still professional, but something in the tone changes. The column headings are the same, the format is the same, but the notations grow longer. Classification specialists, as a professional culture, valued brevity. Long notations are a sign that what was observed did not fit easily into the available categories. I know this because I am, myself, a professional who values brevity in notation, and I know what it feels like when what you are looking at does not fit into the available categories. You write more words. You are trying to build the right container in real time. The fourth cycle entry that I consider the hinge point reads, and I am translating from Veth-Amoran administrative notation, which is dense and context-dependent and does not map cleanly to standard, but I will give you the substance of it. Cycle 4, Survey Vessel Designation 7SRNAK, Anomalous Reading AT Inner Boundary of Sector 9. Military Infrastructure Expansion AT rate approximately 31% above Cycle 3 baseline. Cross-area G with standard integration TARGETS. No comparable rate identified in 63 prior cases. Expansion does not correlate with OBSERVED external threat profile. Sector 9 appears to expand military infrastructure in the absence of external provocation. Query flagged for Senior Classification Review. Recommend extended observation before Phase 2 contact. Tava had been leaning forward as I read. She was quiet for a moment after. They thought humans were being aggressive toward someone else, she said. Someone nearby. They thought there was an explanation that fit their model, I said. Yes, that is what experienced classification specialists do when they encounter something that doesn't fit the model. They look for the version of events that makes the model work. It is a reasonable professional instinct. It is usually correct. I set the fourth cycle entry aside and moved to the fifth. It was not correct in this case. The senior classification review that the fourth cycle entry requested was completed in the fifth cycle. It involved the deployment of 3 additional survey vessels. A senior classification specialist named in the documents as Adran Vel-Suthor, a name I have thought about more than I perhaps should have, in the 31 years since I first read it, and an extended observation period of approximately 2 additional standard years. Adran Vel-Suthor's report is the longest single document in the folder. It runs to 41 pages in its original format, and I have condensed it over the years to what I consider its essential content. I will give you that condensed version now, because the full 41 pages contain a great deal of technical notation and administrative procedure that is meaningful only if you are a Veth-Amoran classification specialist, which neither Tava nor I are. The condensed version is this. The Veth-Amoran's model for assessing military infrastructure assumed that military expansion was a response to threat. Civilizations built military capacity because they were threatened by external actors, or because they anticipated being threatened, or because they were planning to threaten others. These were the 3 recognized drivers. All 63 prior integration targets had conformed to this model. You could look at a civilization's military expansion rate and cross-reference it against its diplomatic posture and its territorial ambitions and its historical conflict record, and you could understand the military expansion as a rational response to a comprehensible strategic environment. Adran Vel-Suthor's extended observation found that Sector 9's military expansion did not conform to any of the 3 recognized drivers. There were no external threats that the survey vessels could identify. The neighboring territories were peaceful or were themselves in Veth-Amoran integration processes and were not in any position to threaten anyone. Sector 9's diplomatic posture was not particularly aggressive. They were expanding their interstellar presence, but in a way that looked, from the outside, like exploration rather than annexation. And their historical conflict record, which the survey vessels reconstructed through signal intercepts over the extended observation period, was complex and internally turbulent. They had fought one another extensively and recently, but there was no ongoing external conflict that could explain the rate of military infrastructure growth. Adran Veth-Amoran's conclusion was not that the humans were planning to attack someone. His conclusion was that they were simply building, that the expansion of military capacity was not, for this civilization, a response to a specific threat. It was an activity. It was, in some sense, he struggled to articulate in 41 pages of careful administrative notation, what they did. The way another civilization might expand its agricultural infrastructure or its communications network or its trade routes, Sector 9 expanded its capacity for violence. Not in preparation for anything in particular, as a general practice, as what appeared to be a civilizational reflex. He flagged this finding for immediate review by the Central Reach. He also noted, in a paragraph near the end of his report that reads with a quality I can only describe as carefully controlled alarm, that the survey vessels had recently detected evidence suggesting that Sector 9 had become aware of something in their outer system. Not the survey vessels themselves. The signals were too faint for that, but something. An anomaly. A pattern in the darkness that did not match the background. And that Sector 9's response to this anomaly had been to immediately vector 3 military vessels toward it. The anomaly was a piece of debris from a Veth-Amoran survey vessel that had suffered a navigation failure in the 3rd cycle and lost a section of its outer hull plating. The hull plating had been drifting since then, a centimeter-long piece of alloy at the extreme outer edge of the sector, too small to register on any reasonable sensor array. Sector 9 had found it. The 3 military vessels that responded to the debris did not find the survey ships. The survey ships had already moved to a different position, but the response time, the speed at which the military vessels had moved, the precision with which they had located something that small at that distance, went into Adran Veth-Amoran's report as a notation in a column labeled Sensor Capability. Actual, against which he had written simply, EXCEDS Model PARAMETERS. Do not assume continued undetected observation. He told them to pull the survey vessels back, Teva asked. He recommended it, I said. The Central Reach did not act on that recommendation. I moved to the next set of documents. The Central Reach's response to Adran Veth-Amoran's report was to initiate Phase 2 contact. I want to be fair to the Veth-Amoran Central Reach here, in the way that I try to be fair to all the subjects of historical files, because fairness is a professional obligation even when, especially when, the subject of the file is a civilization that no longer exists, and the decisions being examined led directly to that non-existence. The Central Reach's decision to proceed with Phase 2 contact, viewed from inside their operational framework, was not unreasonable. They had a system that had worked 63 times. They had a classification specialist's report that identified some anomalies, but ultimately confirmed the territory was a viable integration target. They had administrative momentum. Phase 3 integration processes were already underway in 11 other sectors simultaneously, and the Central Reach operated on a planning cycle that did not readily accommodate extended delays. They also, and this is documented explicitly in the Central Reach's authorization memo, which is the document that follows Adran Veth-Amoran's report in the folder. They also had a specific counterargument to the concern about military capacity. The memo reads, in relevant part, classification note, military infrastructure capacity is not a material obstacle to integration protocol implementation. Prior cases include 6 targets with above-average military capacity. In all 6 cases, Phase 2 contact produced compliance within standard parameters. Military capacity is a deterrent against peer threat. The Veth-Amoran administrative reach is not a peer threat but an administrative authority. Compliance history, INDICATS-TARGTS. Do not resist administrative authority, AT, equivalent rates, to military peer, THREATS. Tava stared at that for a moment. They thought humans would comply because humans were used to dealing with administrative authorities, she said. The Veth-Amoran had a theory, I said, that the experience of living under governance, any governance, even internal, created a kind of compliance instinct, that civilizations which had developed complex internal administrative structures were, paradoxically, more receptive to external administrative authority because the concept was familiar. Their data supported this theory across 63 cases. And the humans had very complex internal administrative structures. Extraordinarily complex, I said. Multiple competing governance systems, multiple jurisdictions, overlapping administrative layers. By the Veth-Amoran's metrics, they scored in the 94th percentile for internal administrative complexity among all observed civilizations. I let that sit for a moment. The Central Reach considered this a favorable indicator. Phase 2 contact was initiated in what the Veth-Amoran's records call the 7th administrative cycle of the Sector 9 survey. A diplomatic vessel, the records name it the Veth-Amoran Administrative Reach Vessel Suthorak, which translates roughly as administrative voice, was dispatched to make first contact with Sector 9's primary governing authorities. The vessel carried a standard diplomatic complement: 3 senior diplomatic administrators, a translation specialist, a security detail of 12, and the standard documentation package, the Integration Protocol Charter, the Chip Census Implementation Guidelines, the Administrative Designation Paperwork, and what the Veth-Amoran called the terms of orderly transition, which was their formalized language for the process by which a territory's existing governance structures were dissolved and replaced with sector offices. The Suthorak made contact. This is confirmed in its departure log and in the early transmission records included in the folder. The early transmissions are routine: confirmation of contact established, preliminary communication protocols exchanged, a notation that translation was proceeding with some difficulty but within acceptable parameters. There is a transmission from the 7th cycle, approximately 3 weeks after initial contact, in which the lead diplomatic administrator notes that the human governing authorities have requested time to review the integration protocol documentation, and that this request has been granted, consistent with standard Phase 2 procedure. There is one more transmission after that. It is dated 4 days after the request for review transmission. It is very short. I will read it to you as it appears in the folder, because unlike most of the documents in this file, which require context and translation, this one does not require either. SUTHRAK 2 Central Reach, Transmission Priority Absolute, Phase 2 Contact Outcome, Unclassified, Human Governing AUTHRIES have DCLINED Integration Protocol. Clarification: the declination was not COMMUNICATD in a form that has a category in OUR Standard Response Taxonomy. RETURNING 2 Staging Point. Request senior classification review before any further contact. Do not send additional vessels to Sector 9 without senior review. Repeat, do not send additional vessels. Tava was very still. What did they say, she asked, the humans, when they declined? I turned the page. That is not in the file, I said. The lead diplomatic administrator's personal debrief was filed separately, under a different classification, and it is not in this folder. I do not know what Sector 9 told the Suthorak's delegation. I know only what the transmission says: that the response did not fit a standard category, that the delegation considered it important enough to request senior review before any further contact, and that they felt urgently enough about this to mark the transmission priority absolute. I gave her a moment with that. The Veth-Amoran had a standard response taxonomy for Phase 2 contact outcomes. There were 7 categories: full acceptance, conditional acceptance, request for extended review, administrative objection with negotiation, formal refusal with counterproposal, formal refusal without counterproposal, and hostile refusal with threat of military action. These 7 categories covered every Phase 2 outcome they had encountered in 63 previous cases. The delegation filed the human response as unclassified. They had never filed a Phase 2 outcome as unclassified before. Because it didn't fit any of the 7. Because it didn't fit any of the 7. I set the Veth-Amoran transmission aside. I picked up the next document. The Central Reach convened a senior review, I said. It took them 48 administrative days. During those 48 days, the Veth-Amoran remained at the staging point and filed daily status reports, all of which are in this folder and all of which are identical. Sector 9 status, unchanged. Staging point MAINTAINED. Awaiting senior review authorization. No incidents. No contact initiated from either side. 48 days of a diplomatic vessel sitting at the edge of a sector. It had been told not to re-enter, filing the same 6 words every day. I looked at Teva. That is actually the most frightening document in this folder, I said. 48 daily reports all saying the same thing, because it tells you that for 48 days, the delegation on that vessel knew something well enough to stay exactly where they were and say nothing except that they were staying exactly where they were. Teva said nothing. Good. The senior review produced a document called, in Veth-Amoran administrative language, a protocol variance assessment, which was the Central Reach's formal mechanism for deciding how to handle an integration target that had not conformed to standard Phase 2 outcomes. The Protocol Variance Assessment for Sector 9 is a remarkable document in its own right, and I have spent time with it over the years, and I want to give you the shape of it fairly. The assessment acknowledges, in measured administrative language, that the Phase 2 contact outcome represents an anomalous result requiring non-standard response planning. It reviews Adran Veth-Amoran's earlier report and notes the military capacity concerns he raised. It notes the Veth-Amoran delegation's request for caution. And then it proceeds, in the measured and methodical way that Veth-Amoran administrative documents always proceeded, to lay out 3 potential courses of action and their projected outcomes. Option 1, withdraw, redesignate Sector 9 as an integration target of indeterminate complexity. Suspend protocol application pending further observation. The assessment's projected outcome for this option: significant delay to Eastern expansion timeline, loss of administrative momentum, potential precedent effect on other integration targets if observed to withdraw. Option 2, extended negotiation. Deploy a more senior diplomatic complement to Sector 9 with an expanded mandate to negotiate modified integration terms. The assessment's projected outcome: possible path to integration on modified timeline, though the anomalous Phase 2 outcome creates uncertainty about negotiation receptivity. Option 3, Phase 3 implementation without Phase 2 compliance. In the 63 prior integration cases, Phase 3, chip census implementation, had always followed successful Phase 2 contact. The protocol variance assessment proposed, for the first time in Veth-Amoran administrative history, implementing Phase 3 without Phase 2 compliance. The reasoning was as follows. Phase 2 was intended to secure a governing authority's formal agreement to the integration process. But the Veth-Amoran's administrative theory held that the chip census, once implemented at sufficient coverage, functioned independently of governing authority agreement. Once individuals had the identification implants, the administrative apparatus could be built around them regardless of whether their governments had formally agreed to the process. You didn't need the consent of the institution. You needed the reach. The assessment recommended Option 3. The Central Reach approved it. I turned the page. I am going to read you the chip census implementation plan, I said to Teva, "and I want you to listen carefully, because it tells you something important about what the Veth-Amoran understood about themselves and what they did not understand about who they were dealing with." The implementation plan is 72 pages long and covers, in technical detail, the logistics of deploying chip census infrastructure across a sector the size of Sector 9. It discusses the distribution mechanisms, automated dispersal systems, designed to operate below the detection threshold of the target population, deploying identification implants via atmospheric and environmental vectors. It discusses the processing infrastructure, the data collection and analysis systems that would receive implant signals, compile population data, build the administrative picture. It discusses the timeline, a rolling implementation by population density zone, estimated at 3 to 4 administrative cycles for full sector coverage. It is a precise and thorough document. Every logistical element is addressed. Every contingency is considered. The plan is well designed for what it is designed to do. There is one word it does not contain. I have read those 72 pages 4 times over the years, and the word does not appear anywhere in them. The word is consequence. Not what would happen if the implementation succeeded. The plan is thorough about that. But what would happen if Sector 9 noticed? What Sector 9 might do if they found an automated dispersal system in their atmosphere? What a civilization that scores in the 94th percentile for internal administrative complexity. That has fought itself extensively and recently, and built military infrastructure at rates that exceed all prior models. What that civilization might decide about an external administrative authority that had just attempted to implant identification chips in their population without consent. There is no contingency for that. The implementation plan does not address it. The word resistance appears twice in 72 pages, both times in the context of sensor interference modeling for the dispersal systems, not in the context of what the humans might do. I have thought about this for 31 years. My conclusion is not that the Veth-Amoran were stupid. They were not stupid. They were one of the most sophisticated administrative civilizations in the Carthari Belt's recorded history. My conclusion is that they had administered 63 civilizations without ever encountering one that responded to administrative action the way a pure military threat would. The compliance history was absolute. When the Veth-Amoran had said this is being done to you, it had always been done. The 63 had objected, argued, negotiated, pleaded, and ultimately complied. The concept that a civilization might not comply, might not merely resist in the ways that previous civilizations had resisted, but might respond to the chip census implementation the way it would respond to a military attack. This concept does not appear in the implementation plan, because it did not live in the Veth-Amoran's model of how civilizations behaved. They had never built a model for it, because they had never needed one. They had never needed one because they had never, in 63 cases, reached a civilization that had built its military infrastructure the way Sector 9 had built its military infrastructure, not in response to threats, not in preparation for specific conflicts, but as a general practice, as a reflex, as the thing they did. They had never reached a civilization for which the chip census implementation would not be an administrative action. It would be a first strike. I turned to the next section of the folder. The implementation began in the 41st administrative cycle, I said. The dispersal systems were deployed in the outer zones of Sector 9 first, consistent with the plan's rolling implementation approach. The first cycle of deployment proceeded without incident. The data collection systems began receiving signals from the implants. The administrative picture began to build. The Central Reach received the first population data reports from Sector 9 and classified them under standard administrative intake procedures. I turned the page. The second cycle of deployment was scheduled to begin in what Veth-Amoran timekeeping calls the 23rd day of the 42nd administrative cycle. I turned to the document that was dated that day. It is a single page. The header is the standard Veth-Amoran administrative format, and the content begins as a routine operational status report, the kind of document that would have been filed hundreds of times over the course of the implementation plan, updating the central reach on dispersal system performance and implant signal reception rates. The report ends 6 lines in. The last entry in those 6 lines is a sensor reading. The Veth-Amoran survey vessel that was providing logistical support to the dispersal systems had detected something, a power signature, large, multiple sources, converging on the dispersal system's position from 3 vectors. After that line, the operational status report ends. There is no further text, no notation, no closing administrative stamp. The report was transmitted and received, and the central reach logged it in their system, and that is the last communication from that vessel. How many vessels were supporting the implementation by then? Teva asked. I looked at the deployment roster that was included in the folder. In the 42nd cycle, I said, the Veth-Amoran had 11 survey vessels, 4 data processing platforms, 2 administrative logistics vessels, and 1 senior coordination vessel in or adjacent to Sector 9's outer zones. 18 vessels total. Additionally, at the staging point approximately 12 light towers beyond the sector boundary, the Veth-Amoran and 2 additional diplomatic vessels were stationed. Teva was doing arithmetic. 21 vessels. 21 vessels, I confirmed, and a dispersal infrastructure that had been built over the previous 3 administrative cycles at considerable investment, because the Veth-Amoran built their administrative infrastructure to last. It was not designed to be temporary. It was designed to be the foundation of a sector office. I turned to the next document. The Central Reach received the truncated operational status report on the 23rd day of the 42nd cycle. They waited for follow-up communication. Standard protocol in cases of transmission interruption was to wait 12 hours and then attempt direct contact. The Central Reach waited 12 hours. I paused. Then they waited another 12. The document I was looking at was the Central Reach's internal communication log for the 3 days following the truncated report. It is a bureaucratic document, dry and precise, and its dryness is not a failure of record-keeping, but a measure of how completely the Veth-Amoran administrative system was built for routine. The log records, in orderly entries at regular intervals, the Central Reach's attempts to re-establish contact with its vessels in Sector 9's outer zones. Standard hailing frequencies, diplomatic frequencies, emergency frequencies, the staging point at the sector boundary, the Veth-Amoran. Every entry ends with the same notation, no response received. The log runs for 72 hours, 144 entries filed at 30-minute intervals, 144 times no response received. I have never read this document without thinking about the person who filed those entries. Someone at a communication station in the Central Reach, doing their job with administrative precision, filing each negative response result in the correct column at the correct interval, for 72 hours, as the silence from 21 vessels accumulated entry by entry into something that had no category in the standard response taxonomy. At the end of the 72 hours, I said, the Central Reach dispatched a reconnaissance vessel to the staging point. The staging point was the outermost position, 12 light towers beyond the sector boundary, well outside Sector 9 itself. The Veth-Amoran and the 2 diplomatic vessels had been stationed there for years. The reconnaissance vessel was instructed to proceed only to the staging point, confirm the status of the diplomatic vessels, and report. I turned the page. The reconnaissance vessel reached the staging point on the 4th day after the truncated report. The reconnaissance report is the second shortest document in the folder. It is 9 lines long. I will not read you all 9 lines because several of them are technical sensor readings, position data, navigation logs, but the substance of them is this. The staging point was empty. The Veth-Amoran and the 2 diplomatic vessels were not there. There was no debris, no wreckage, no distress signal, no emergency buoy, no navigation beacon left behind, no evidence that 3 vessels had ever been stationed at that position. The staging point was clear. The reconnaissance vessel ran its sensor array at maximum range toward Sector 9's outer boundary and recorded nothing. No vessel signatures, no communication signals, no dispersal infrastructure, no data processing platforms, nothing. The outer zones of Sector 9 were, to the reconnaissance vessel's sensors, as empty as they had been before the survey began. The reconnaissance vessel's commanding officer filed a notation at the end of the 9-line report. It was not standard administrative format. It was 3 words. Do not return. Then the reconnaissance vessel came home. I want to pause here, because I have read that notation many times and I have thought about what it cost someone to file it. The Veth-Amoran were administrators. Their professional culture was built on the premise that the correct response to incomplete information was more information, more survey ships, more observation cycles, more data, more analysis. Every difficult situation in their 400-year history had been addressed by applying more administrative process to it. The reconnaissance vessel's commanding officer was trained in that culture. She had been dispatched to gather information and file a report, and she had done that, and the information she had gathered was that there was nothing to report except the absence of 21 vessels and a staging point empty of everything it should have contained. And instead of recommending further investigation, instead of flagging for extended survey or requesting additional reconnaissance assets or proposing a new observation cycle, she wrote 3 words and brought her ship home. She knew something that 3 words could communicate and 41 pages could not. She had been to the edge of that sector. She had run her sensors at maximum range toward the boundary. She had seen, or not seen, whatever was there to be seen. And 3 words was the complete record of what she judged it necessary to say. The Central Reach did not send another vessel to Sector 9 after the reconnaissance report. This is documented in the administrative log. The log records, in the orderly way Veth-Amoran logs recorded everything, that the recommendation in the reconnaissance report was reviewed, that the Central Reach's Senior Administrative Council convened an emergency session, and that the session produced a resolution. No further approach to Sector 9 boundary. The resolution passed unanimously. The log records no dissent, no abstention, no request for extended deliberation. In 41 pages, Adran Veth-Amoran had tried to explain what his survey instruments were showing him and had recommended caution. In 3 words, the reconnaissance officer had communicated something that required no deliberation at all. I have sometimes wondered what she saw in those sensor returns, what was at maximum range toward the boundary that settled the question in 3 words rather than 11 cycles. The sensor data was not included in the reconnaissance report filed with the Central Reach. The report says only, sensor sweep conducted, range maximum, RESULTS APPENDD2 vessel log. The vessel log is not in this folder. I do not know if it still exists. I do not know if I would request it if it did. There are things it is professionally necessary to know, and things it is professionally sufficient to have noted. Teva had not moved in some time. She was sitting very still with her hands on the table, and she was looking at the folder with an expression I recognized, because I had worn it the first time I read these documents. Not horror exactly, not shock exactly, but the particular look of a person who has been handed a shape they cannot hold and is sitting with it anyway because there is nowhere to put it down. The Central Reach filed a full administrative review, I said, and I kept my voice level because this is my job, to read the documents and report their contents with precision and without embellishment. They interviewed the reconnaissance vessel's crew. They reviewed every communication log, every sensor record, every deployment roster. They attempted, over the following 4 administrative cycles, to re-establish contact with Sector 9 through indirect channels, through third-party civilizations that had trade relationships with humans, through long-range signal probes, through every mechanism available to a sophisticated administrative civilization with significant resources. I turned to the last set of documents in the folder. They received no response to any of it, not a rejection, not a warning, not a hostile signal of any kind. No response. Sector 9's communication networks were operating. The signal probes confirmed that. The humans were talking to each other, trading with other civilizations, going about their affairs. They simply did not respond to anything the Veth-Amoran sent, as though the Veth-Amoran had not sent it, as though the Veth-Amoran's attempts at contact were signals from a source that did not merit acknowledgement. I let that land. The administrative review concluded after 4 cycles. The Central Reach issued a final designation document for Sector 9. It is the last document in this folder, and I will read it to you in full, because it is short and because every word of it matters. I lifted the final document. Sector 9, Final Administrative Status Review. Veth-Amoran Central Reach, Administrative Year 1104. Outcome, Integration Protocol, discontinued. Reason, irrecoverable contact failure. Vessels, 21 DPLOID, 0 RTRNED. Diplomatic complement, 3 vessels, 0 RTRNED. Dispersal infrastructure, 0 signal since cycle 42, day 23. Classified personnel lost. Number REDACTEDBYKARTHARI Guild. Note: redaction applied at time of file transfer. Original figure ON file in SCALED Master Archive. Recommendation: Sector 9 Integration Target Designation, REVOKD. Sector 9 reclassified as Administrative Exclusion Zone. Notation: no further contact attempts to be initiated by any Veth-Amoran administrative authority or contracted party. Notation: this document CONSTITUTES, the final administrative action of the Eastern Expansion Division. Notation: the Eastern Expansion Division is hereby formally DISSOLVD. Notation: the Central Reach ACKNOWLEDGES, that no administrative framework currently EXISDS for the circumstances DESCRIBED in THIS review, and that the development of such a framework is. Here the document ends. The last sentence is unfinished. The document was transmitted to the Carthari Guild as part of a records transfer that occurred approximately 2 administrative cycles after its date. A records transfer that included not just this folder, but the entire remaining archive of the Veth-Amoran Central Reach, because the Central Reach had made the decision to transfer its administrative records to the Guild for permanent archival retention. And the reason it had made that decision is because the Central Reach was, at the time of the transfer, in the process of completing the formal dissolution of the Veth-Amoran Administrative Reach. Not due to Sector 9. I want to be precise about this. The Reach's dissolution was not the result of military action from Sector 9. Sector 9 had not pursued the Veth-Amoran. There was no punitive expedition, no retaliatory fleet. What Sector 9 had done with the Veth-Amoran is documented in the reconnaissance report. Nothing. The staging point was empty and the outer zones were clean, and that was the totality of what Sector 9 chose to communicate. What happened to the Veth-Amoran after that was what happens to an administrative civilization that loses its confidence in its own system. The integration protocol had been the Central Reach's operating framework for 400 years. It had worked 63 times. It had built the Reach into the dominant administrative force in the Carthari Belt. And then it had not worked, had failed in a way that went beyond failure. in a way that did not produce a lesson that could be incorporated into the protocol, because there was no version of the protocol that could be modified to account for what had happened. And the Veth-Amoran, who were administrators in the deepest sense of the word, had no framework for operating without the protocol. The dissolution took 11 years. It was orderly. Of course it was orderly. The Veth-Amoran dissolved their administrative empire the way they had built it, methodically, with proper documentation, with formal transfer of responsibilities and records, with consideration for the territories they had integrated, and what would become of those sector offices without central reach oversight. They were professionals to the end. The records transfer to the Carthari Guild was part of that dissolution, a decision that there was value in having the records preserved by a neutral archival authority, even if the reach itself was ceasing to operate. The final document in the folder, the final administrative action of the Eastern Expansion Division, the one with the unfinished sentence, was transmitted to us 2 cycles before the Central Reach filed its own formal dissolution paperwork. I do not know what the last sentence was going to say. I have thought about it many times. The Central Reach ACKNOWLEDGES that no administrative framework currently EXISTS for the circumstances DESCRIBED in THIS review, and that the development of such a framework is what? Necessary. Impossible. Beyond our capacity. Something that would have required a word or phrase in Veth-Amoran administrative language that does not translate into standard. I have decided over 31 years that the unfinished sentence is the most honest document in the folder. Every other document in here is complete. Every other document says what it means to say and ends where it means to end, and is filed correctly and cross-referenced, and given its proper administrative weight. The last one is unfinished because there was nothing to finish it with. The thing they had encountered had taken the sentence away before they could close it. I closed the folder. Teva had not asked any questions for a long time. She asked one now. What did the guild do with the files? The guild verified the contents, I said. 3 master archivists reviewed the complete transfer, including this folder. We confirmed accuracy and provenance. We applied our guild date stamps to the verified documents, which you saw on the survey manifest when you opened the folder. And then we resealed it, I said, this folder, and we updated the sector designation for what the Veth-Amoran had called Sector 9. In Carthari Guild records, it is designated uncharted survey status, suspended indefinitely. The suspension notation in the master catalog reads, Historical Contact Record Adverse Outcome. KARTHARI Guild Recommendation. No survey activity. That's all, no warning, no. The margin notation in the master catalog, I said, reads, Administrative Contact Not Recommended. Teva stared at me. I held her gaze for a moment. Then I stood and I picked up the folder and I walked it back to the sublevel stacks myself, because I have always done that myself and I see no reason to change the practice now. The drawer that it lives in is the 3rd from the left in the 2nd sublevel row, and the pin that locks it has that slight fusing from decades of disuse. And when I fitted the folder back into its place and worked the pin back into its housing, I felt the familiar resistance of it, and then the small click when it seated properly. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the drawer. 21 vessels, 3 diplomatic ships, an unfinished sentence. A sector that did not pursue its attacker, did not warn anyone, did not do anything as far as any record shows except return to silence. The same silence it had maintained before the Veth-Amoran arrived, the silence it will presumably maintain long after the last memory of the Veth-Amoran administrative reach has faded from every archive except this one. I had been a cartographer for 54 years. I had spent those years making the unknown known, plotting positions, confirming coordinates, updating charts, putting the right shape on the right piece of the galaxy, so that the civilizations navigating it could do so with confidence. That is the guild's function. That is what we are for. I left the drawer locked and went back upstairs. Tava was still at the table when I returned. She had not moved the folder's placement from where I had set things aside while reading. She was looking at the table surface with that same expression. I sat back down. "You want to know," I said, "what administrative contact not recommended means?" She looked up. "It means," I said, "that the Carthari Guild reviewed 61 documents, 312 pages of Veth-Amoran administrative record, the complete operational history of a 400-year expansion protocol that worked 63 consecutive times, and the account of what happened when that protocol was applied to a sector whose governing philosophy regarding external administrative authority was, apparently, that external administrative authority was not a category separate from military threat." I let that settle. "It means that the 3 master archivists who sat in this room that night looked at what an empire of administrators had done when they decided that humanity could be classified, chipped, partitioned, and processed, and looked at what had happened to that empire, and then looked at each other and looked at the map and made a notation." I looked at Tava. "Administrative contact, not recommended," I said, "is the most precise language 4 experienced cartographers could find for what the Veth-Amoran's records teach. It is not a warning that humans will attack you. It is a notation that the last civilization to bring administrative authority to bear on human space discovered that human space does not recognize administrative authority as a distinct category from any other form of imposition." Tava said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's why the Eastern Expansion Division dissolved." "Eastern Expansion Division dissolved," I said, "because the Central Reach had no framework for what had happened to their vessels. But the reason they had no framework is because the integration protocol had never encountered a civilization for which there was no distinction between an administrative action and an act of war. The chip census, to the Veth-Amoran, was paperwork. It was infrastructure. It was the unremarkable technical mechanism of a process they had completed 63 times. I paused. To Sector 9, it was something else. I did not elaborate. The folder is sealed. The sector is designated uncharted. The margin notation says what the margin notation says, and it has said it for 31 years, and I have no plans to change it, because it is accurate, and because accuracy is the only obligation I have ever owed this work. After a while, Tava gathered the documents I had read aloud and placed them back in their original order. She has that instinct, the good archival instinct, the one that knows that things belong in a particular sequence. And she did not ask me again what the notation meant. She did ask one more question. She asked it quietly, as she was squaring the edges of the last set of documents, and she did not look up when she asked it. "The 63 civilizations that complied," she said, "did they know about Sector 9 after?" I considered the question. "Some of them," I said. "The ones that had been in the Reach long enough to have their own administrative records cross-referenced with the Eastern Expansion files. When the Reach dissolved and the records were transferred here, there were officials in several of the former integrated territories who had access to enough of the administrative history to reconstruct the broad shape of what had happened. Not the details, not this folder specifically, but the shape." "What did they do with it?" "The ones I have records for," I said, "updated their own navigational charts to reflect the Carthari Guild's designation. Uncharted, survey suspended, and a few of them added their own margin notations, not in our format, in their own guild and administrative formats, but the substance was similar." I looked at the table where the folder had been. One of the former integrated territories, the Shanvethari, who were the second civilization integrated into the Reach, and had therefore been under Veth-Amoran administration for the longest, filed a formal request with the Carthari Guild to have their own cartographic notation added to the master record for Sector 9. The request was reviewed and approved. Their notation is in the master catalog, in the margin section, below ours. Tava looked up. What does it say? It says, I told her, in Shanvethari cartographic notation, which is a very old format and uses symbolic rather than alphabetic characters. The shape that means something is present here, followed by the shape that means it does not require your presence in return, followed by the shape that means this is not a warning but a statement of observed fact. Tava was quiet for a moment. That's actually more frightening than not recommended, she said. Yes, I said, it is. She is 22 years old and sharp, and she has now sat with 61 documents for several hours, and she knows what the notation means. The drawer is in the sublevel stacks, third from the left in the second row. The sector on the master chart is colored the pale gray we use for uncharted space, and the notation is printed in the small text we use for margin entries, and it has been that color and that text for 31 years, and it will be that color and that text for as long as this guild keeps its charts. Which is to say, indefinitely. The Veth-Amoran filed 61 documents about a civilization they had decided to process. They filed them precisely, professionally, with the full weight of a 400-year administrative tradition behind every entry and every notation. The civilization they were filing has no documents in this guild's archive at all. Only the Veth-Amoran's paperwork remains, sealed in a drawer, to say that the contact was attempted, and to record, in administrative language, in the only language the Veth-Amoran knew, that no administrative framework currently exists for what they found there, and that the development of such a framework is